All right. Well, I guess we should get started.
Okay.
All right. So, first of all, I have some bad news. So it looks like on at least this screen, it still lists Scott Cave as presenting, and he is not. And neither is Ava. She said yesterday that she was unable to present. So it will just be the two of us. So two papers, and that is all for today. But first, let me welcome you all as well. I know we wish we were all in New Orleans, having a fantastic time. But alas, COVID gets another conference. So I guess I will introduce myself and then present, and then I will introduce Casey, and then she will give her paper. So I am an associate professor of Latin American history at the University of West Florida. I teach classes on colonial and modern Latin America, but really specializing in the Caribbean and Atlantic worlds. My book, Captives of Conquest, Indigenous Slavery in the Early Modern Spanish Caribbean, was recently published in June 2021, and it examines the evolution and impact of the earliest indigenous slave trade in the Spanish Caribbean and larger empire. And so the paper that I'm giving today is definitely, it comes out of that book. So let me share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. All right. Slide 2. So my paper today is titled Loopholes in the Law, the Blurred Lines of Indigenous Slavery in the Spanish Caribbean. Until June of 1500, there were few, if any, restrictions or laws controlling the nascent indigenous slave trade in the Circum-Caribbean. Then in 1500, Queen Isabella declared the trade illegal and all indigenous peoples as free. But the order did little to halt the raiders, merchants, and colonists already operating in the Americas. Yet it did prevent the trade from growing, at least for a time, until 1503, when Isabella reversed her previous decree and made it legal to enslave all cannibals or Carib Indians. Concurrent with this legislation was the renewal of the taking of Tainos in just war on Hispaniola. While Isabella's ruling still nominally prohibited the enslavement of peaceful Indians in the Americas, the provision allowed for the enslavement of all rebellious subjects. In addition, she decreed that Indians had to labor for Spanish colonists to construct towns, extract gold, and provide food and other goods. The Spanish were to arrange the labor schedule with the island's caciques and pay every Indian a small salary. If the Indians refused to work, however, they could be forced to complete these tasks, but always as free men, not as slaves. The contradictory nature of these laws was immediately apparent, nor were the laws permanent. Over the ensuing decades, laws controlling the Indian slave trade changed nearly every year in response to various economic, religious, or political developments, leaving loopholes for slave raiders, colonists, and conquistadors across the Americas. The loopholes both allowed for massive numbers of illegal or somewhat legal slaving raids and prevented the documentation of said slaving. As the Spanish Empire grew, new discoveries, philosophies, and businesses either supported or condemned Indian slavery. Each new wave, authority, or development altered the laws governing indigenous enslavement. At times, the laws even changed within months. This made the status of Indian slaves and slavery ambiguous for much of the 16th century. Many conquistadors, explorers, and raiders took advantage of this ambiguity and confusion to conduct illegal or partially legal slave raids into the interiors of North and South America. This paper examines the chaotic evolution of the indigenous slave trade during the first half of the 16th century. In particular, I use the 1536 court case of Jerónimo Ortal to dissect the intricacies and contradictions endemic in indigenous slave law in the burgeoning Spanish Empire. First, though, I will review the legal ways that Indians could be enslaved in the Spanish Americas, beginning in 1503. The first way was through the labeling as cannibals or Caribs. In 1503, Isabella designated the islands of San Bernardo, Fuerte, and Barra, the ports of Cartagena, the Venezuelan coastline, and anywhere where the cannibals are, as Carib lands. Demonstrating the purely economic character of this designation, none of these lands actually corresponded with reports of cannibalism. Instead, the territories marked as Carib were those close to areas the Spanish believed held mineral wealth. Between 1509 and 1512, the rest of the Lesser Antilles and much of Tierra Firme were added to the list. Any method used to capture the Carib slaves was legal, from rescate, meaning ransom literally, but often meaning trade for slaves, whether voluntary or forced, to extreme violence. Small slaving expeditions captured Carib Indians from 1503 forward, and as the Taino population continued to fall, efforts to replenish the island's labor force only increased the number of expeditions setting sail for Carib lands. In 1511, the Crown expanded the list of Carib islands, legalizing war on the inhabitants of all of the Lesser Antilles, legalizing their capture, transportation to, and enslavement in Hispaniola or Puerto Rico. And the slave trade only grew due to an indigenous uprising in Puerto Rico in late 1510 into 1511. In the late summer of 1510, up to 30 caciques in Puerto Rico met secretly to plot a rebellion against the Spaniards. First, they attacked the encomendero Cristobal de Sotomayor, and then next, the cacique Aguebana and 3,000 Indians attacked and burned down a new town of Aguada. This began a general uprising that lasted for several years. Throughout the conflict, the Crown licensed the governor of Puerto Rico to enslave all Indians taken during the fighting and to brand them with an F on their legs and arms. They were then sold in the markets of Hispaniola. But the violence was not limited to the Tainos of Puerto Rico. According to officials, Caribs from neighboring islands of Santa Cruz and Guadalupe joined the Tainos of Puerto Rico in their uprising. By 1513, there was concrete evidence that a coalition of Tainos from Puerto Rico with Indians from the Leeward Islands worked together to burn the northern settlement of Capara, killing 18 Spaniards. In the end, the Spanish, with the help of some allied caciques, were able to defeat the indigenous coalition, reportedly killing thousands in battle and taking many more thousands captive. Aguebana's rebellion prompted the government in Hispaniola to issue a royal order at the end of 1511, declaring general war on all Caribs and calling for their immediate enslavement and relocation to Hispaniola. By the summer of 1512, officials had organized 2 large armadas to punish the Caribs and engage in rescate for slaves and pearls in Dominica and the Virgin Islands. Then in 1514, King Ferdinand went beyond authorizing slaving expeditions and ordered the formation of a royal armada to attack the Caribs living in Trinidad, Dominica, and Guadalupe, specifically to capture slaves. The rebellion of Aguebana and the ensuing war against the Caribs reveals the second legal justification for the capture and transport of indigenous slaves: just war. Per the definition of just war in the legal code, Siete Partidas, Spaniards could use violence to enforce the dominion of the Spanish crown and Catholic Church in the Americas. The failure to accept Christianity justified enslavement. Just war also allowed enslavement of the losing party and confiscation of their goods. But the war in Puerto Rico was not the first time the Spaniards employed this rationale. Beginning with Columbus's second voyage to the Caribbean, colonists faced indigenous resistance. Only a few weeks after the founding of Isabella, Columbus sent a group into the interior of the island in search of gold. After finding some evidence of gold, Columbus sent a small envoy to visit the cacique Canuabo. They were to deliver gifts and to invite him to La Isabela to meet with Columbus. However, he refused to accompany the Spaniards back to La Isabela, instead communicating that the admiral should come to him. The Spaniards then enacted a new plan, captured Canuabo, and took him to La Isabela. The captivity of this powerful cacique instigated the first full-scale war against the Europeans. During the conflict, they captured over 1,000 Indians, marching them to La Isabela in February of 1495. Because these Indians had assaulted a Spanish settlement, they were legally taken as slaves in just war. Columbus chose the best 500 of the 1,600 captives to send to Spain. The rest were partitioned amongst the Spanish colonists. Thus began the official legal Indian slave trade. Growth of the Indian slave trade allowed the Crown to replace the diminishing Taino population, facilitating the extraction of gold as well as the growth of other industries in the nascent Spanish Empire. The Crown's policy shift towards supporting an indigenous slave trade more and more was pragmatic. King Ferdinand went beyond allowing this existing trade, and in 1508 began to create new ways to expand the industry. After Isabella's death, he authorized the enslaving of Indians from all islas inútiles, or useless islands, meaning those lacking in gold. Beyond the economic benefit of relocating the Indians, the Spanish also argued that the residents of these useless islands would benefit from closer proximity to the Christians, as it would help them to convert to Catholicism. In September 1509, the king sent orders to Governor Ovando to capture and bring as many Indians from outside Hispaniola as possible. The demand for indigenous labor, combined with the crown's new allowances, sparked a huge rise in slaving expeditions from 1509 into 1510. The exact number of voyages and how many Indians were captured by each merchant remains unclear, however. The lack of records surrounding these missions can be explained by the fact that the slavers did not have to pay taxes on the profits gained from the sale of various types of indigenous slaves. Perhaps this is because the profits were so slim. Or this may speak to the moral and legal gray area in which the trade operated, where neither slavers nor officials were certain when they should report an expedition or sale. Another option is that the arrival of Indian slaves in Hispaniola was so commonplace that it seemed unimportant to note. Whether all or one of these was the case, the lack of records makes it difficult to estimate the size of the trade or even to ascertain which traders traveled to useless islands or Carib lands to capture their merchandise. As indigenous populations dwindled, and in response to some early complaints by religious officials concerned with the well-being of America's indigenous peoples, the Crown instituted new practices in 1514, including the reading of the requerimiento, or requirement. This document required the indigenous peoples of the New World to submit religiously and politically to the Crown of Spain and the Catholic Church. Before attacking or enslaving Indians, Spanish soldiers had to read the requirement publicly, giving the native peoples an opportunity to submit peacefully to the new religion and authority. If the Indians failed to submit or refused to accept Christianity, they could then legally be attacked by Spanish soldiers and enslaved. However, the requirement, as with many other laws and policies, did little to change the actions of Spaniards on the ground. Not only was it usually read to indigenous populations who could not understand the speech, but the Spanish often read the requirement from on board their ship or in the middle of the night to an audience of trees and empty huts. With the new requirement in hand, ship after ship set out to attack Caribs, engage in rescate in the Pearl Islands and coast of Tierra Firme, and collect many more Indians living on useless islands. With the islands in upheaval due to the slave trade by the middle of the third decade of colonization, and the slave trade still spiraling out of control, many began to register complaints about the Crown policy and colonial practices. Here we see some of the early arguments against the slave trade and its impacts on the native peoples of the Caribbean. These calls, made by religious and some secular officials, brought about concerted efforts to reform both the Indian slave trade and the general treatment of America's indigenous peoples through new and revised legislation. However, despite efforts by the Crown and religious orders, the Indian slave trade only grew as colonists and even colonial officials ignored the new laws or found ways to get around them. To see this, I will now focus on one case study that reveals myriad loopholes that allowed the indigenous slave trade to thrive, despite Crown efforts to begin to limit it. Shortly after the discovery of the islands Margarita, Coche, and Cubagua, known as the Pearl Islands, located off of Venezuela, Spanish colonists established the first pearl fisheries. The Spaniards employed Guaqueri Indians of Margarita and Lucayos Islands from the Bahamas in these early fisheries. The Spanish found that the local Indians were particularly useful in hunting for new pearl or oyster beds, but there were not enough local or Lucayos Indians to fulfill the fisheries' demands. So Spaniards soon brought slaves from the nearby coast of Venezuela, the Lesser Antilles, and the Yucatan. One of the first Rancheria de Perlas, or pearl fisheries, opened in 1516 on the southern coast of Cubagua. By the 1520s, there were over 100 such fisheries. In the fisheries' most lucrative years, during which they produced up to 1.2 billion pearls, it was illegal for Spaniards to conduct slaving armadas in the Pearl Islands or their adjacent coastlines. The Spanish crown feared that slave raiding would destabilize the region and reduce the profitability of the pearl fisheries. It was even illegal to trade for or purchase Indians already enslaved through rescate. While these laws were not always followed, they did protect the island's Indians from outside enslavement. But this arrangement did not last. By the late 1520s, the coast of Tierra Firme and even some of the Pearl Islands had become harvesting grounds for Indian slaves. Residents from Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico all flocked to the Pearl Islands and surrounding coast of South America in search of indigenous slaves. In 1527 alone, at least 18 expeditions of rescate sailed from Hispaniola to various parts of coastal Tierra Firme. When each of the caravels returned, they all counted Indian slaves amongst their cargo. Like slavers from the Caribbean islands, Pearl Island colonists had to expand their web to obtain enough slaves to complete the dangerous work of pearl collection. Some operations needed as many as 40 Indian divers per day to collect the pearls. And this was perilous work, with many divers drowning or falling victim to shark attacks while working. To fulfill these labor needs, residents of the Pearl Islands conducted frequent raids into Tierra Firme. As the business of slaving grew, competition between slavers increased, resulting in an explosion of violence and legal disputes between the locals of the Pearl Islands and slavers from Hispaniola or Cuba. At the heart of most of these cases was the question of jurisdiction, more specifically, who had the right to legally take Indians from various parts of Tierra Firme. While all of the cases and/or complaints were supported by moral and humanitarian reasons, the real source of quarrels was likely competition for valuable resources, in this case, Indian slaves. Underneath the language of justice, one finds pragmatic or economic reasons behind legislation. Nor were disputes over control of indigenous slaves limited to those between colonies. The Crown also fought to regulate the industry, and at times limit the trade in colonial courtrooms. For example, a royal provision passed in August of 1530 abolished all legal forms of indigenous enslavement in the islands and coast of Tierra Firme, including during just war. The new legislation ended earlier policies from 1503 forward that had provoked massive slave raiding. Though the change in policy could have been prompted by altruistic impulses, it is also possible that widespread tax evasion was the real impetus behind the alteration of laws. Reports abounded across Tierra Firme of colonists failing to pay the royal fifth on all slave sales just before the change in legislation. Regardless of the reasons behind the new law outlawing Indian slavery, whether to protect the Indians or to control the profit from slave raiding, residents and leaders throughout the Caribbean immediately protested the new law and solicited its abolishment. One official, Lopez de Archuleta, a judge in Nueva Cadiz, went so far as to refuse to even publish the legislation. And Archuleta was not the only official to ignore the new policy. Many of Cubagua's elite continued to grant licenses for rescate and to engage in war against rebellious Indians throughout Tierra Firme. While many of the illegal slaving voyages went unpunished or even unquestioned by Caribbean authorities, some of the most prolific slave traders did face legal repercussions. In particular, from 1535 to 1537, a group of Cubaguan officials waged a legal battle against conquistador Geronimo Ortal. At the center of the dispute was the taking and enslaving of hundreds of Indians in the province and Gulf of Paria. Central to the debate was the question of who could profit from either the labor or sale of the Indians in question. Alonso Diaz de Gibraleon of Nueva Cadiz first brought Ortal's attentions to the crown in February of 1536. In his letter, he reminded the king of the royal ordinances forbidding any unauthorized person from taking Indians from the Pearl Islands or the adjacent coastline without express permission and license from a judge in Nueva Cadiz. These laws assured that residents and leaders of Cubagua, at this point a deteriorating colony after the decline of pearl fisheries, controlled the trade in Tierra Firme's Indians. Any legal license, again, only legal if granted by a Cubaguan judge, also limited a slaver to capture rebel or Carib Indians. If the licensed individual enslaved any unsanctioned or allied Indians, they would be banned from Cubagua for 2 months and have to pay a fine to the royal court at Nueva Cadiz of 10,000 maravedis. Among the Indians who were not considered to be rebels and therefore not legal slaves were those inhabiting the coast of Tierra Firme from Maracapana to Enamagoya. Avoiding the involvement of these Indians in the slave trade was especially important to the Cubaguans because these groups helped them in wars against neighboring Carib Indians, coincidentally Indians who they could enslave. Unfortunately for Ortal, it was from the interior of this very area that he engaged in slave raiding, meaning that the slaves he captured were legally free according to current laws. Per the officials of Nueva Cadiz, Ortal and his men entered the province of Cumanagoto via Paria for the express purpose of taking and capturing indigenous slaves. This province was within the government of Cubagua's jurisdiction. Thus, for Ortal to legally capture slaves in these territories, he needed a license from the judges of Nueva Cádiz, something he most definitely did not have in 1535. Therefore, when Ortal's ship anchored in Nueva Cádiz's port, its officials took control of all of the Indians on board, which Ortal had already illegally branded prior to inspection. Whether he gained access to a royal brand or if he forged his own was unspecified. The officials of Cubagua then began a lengthy process to determine if any of the Indians in Ortal's ship had been legally enslaved. If they were slaves, then Cubagua's officials would oversee their sale and take 1/2 of Ortal's profit. However, if the Indians were free, they would be returned to their lands. Until a decision was reached, the Indians remained in the custody of Francisco de Reina, a resident of Nueva Cádiz. In addition to the judgment regarding the future of the Indians, if found guilty, Ortal would have to pay 200 pesos to Nueva Cádiz. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Jeronimo Ortal never possessed the legal right to capture slaves from Paria and Cumanagoto. Regardless, he captured and shipped about 100 Indians to Cubagua, the majority women and children. In addition to the Indian slaves delivered to Cubagua, Ortal had already sold an unknown number in Trinidad. Adding to the crime of operating beyond his jurisdiction, Ortal was also accused of grave atrocities while capturing the Indians in question. According to multiple testimonies, he had gained the slaves through extreme violence, burning and destroying entire towns and robbing surviving Indians of all their clothing and food. This left the region in complete upheaval. Ortal's testimony also revealed that he was not the only Spaniard slaving in Paria and nearby territories. Ortal's men faced competition from the entrada of Antonio Cedeño, the governor of Trinidad. Cedeño's expedition was much larger than Ortal's, with around 600 men. Cedeño also had received financial and legal backing from the court in Santo Domingo, which provided him with a license to explore and engage in rescate in the province of Cumanagoto against the legislation in Nueva Cádiz. At the culmination of his expedition, Cedeño had captured close to 400 slaves that he then took to Puerto Rico, where he sold them publicly without being branded or examined. The presence of both armies unsettled the formerly peaceful province and left it barren and largely depopulated, at least according to the Cubaguans. Despite atrocities committed by Ortal and Cedeño, the court of Nueva Cádiz decided that the Indian captives confiscated from Ortal were in fact legal slaves. The ruling went in direct contradiction of all testimonies presented that described the Indians of Cumanagoto and Paria as allies of the Spanish, even detailing their part in fighting the Caribs. The ruling again proves that despite discourse censoring the capture of peaceful Indians, especially allies of the Spanish, the allure of profit superseded moral impulses. Only adding to the profit from the sale of the slaves, the court of Nueva Cádiz also benefited from the fines levied on the original sellers and purchasers. For example, Francisco de Lerma had to pay 200 pesos, half to the judges of Cubagua and half to the crown, for buying slaves without a license. In another instance, Francisco de Millán had to pay 40 pesos, and Alonso Diaz owed 90 for his indiscretion. Upon deciding that the Indians could be sold, the surviving 34 Indian captives were sold in public on November 14, 1536. The Indians sold for anywhere from 5 to 12 pesos, depending upon their sex and age. Francisco de Reina bought or kept 8 of the Indians that were placed in his care, while the other 26 were sold to various residents of Cubagua. The males sold for more than the females, and the older slaves, i.e. not children, went for a higher price. By the late 1530s, a trade in indigenous slaves had engulfed the Spanish Caribbean. Merchants and officials captured, displaced, and shipped hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples across the Caribbean to toil in mines, plantations, and ranches far from their homes. The search for enslaved laborers inspired exploration, conquest, and kept early Spanish colonies afloat, but it also caused numerous problems. Legislation passed from the laws of Burgos in 1512 onward failed to reform or limit the indigenous slave trade in meaningful ways. Instead, both legal and illegal methods of attaining Indian slaves abounded. Spanish traders and indigenous leaders continued to enslave free Indians, selling them to eager colonists for very low prices. These practices devastated native populations and invoked indigenous uprisings that disrupted colonization, conversion, and trade from the coast of Venezuela and Colombia to Hispaniola and New Spain. Meanwhile, indigenous populations continued to decline across the Spanish Empire in the midst of the conflicts. By the 1540s, most colonists and officials had accepted that the indigenous slave trade was probably not the answer to procuring a sustainable labor force in the Caribbean. With the consequences of the indigenous slave trade in mind, and following years of debate and pressure from religious leaders like Bartolomé de las Casas and Pope Paul III, King Charles I passed a set of legislation known as the New Laws in November of 1542, outlawing most kinds of Indian slavery. The legislation specifically forbid the taking of Indians in warfare, via rescate, and the removal from Indians from any island or tierra firme. Even as new crown legislation attempted to end the legal circum-Caribbean slave trade, Indian slavery continued along Spanish frontiers and borderlands, in some cases for hundreds of years. And even at the core of the empire, Spanish colonists and merchants fought to maintain Indian slavery. It was difficult for colonists to abandon a practice that had been necessary, widespread, and at times lucrative for the previous 5 decades. Thus, colonists still sought new Indian slaves, leading to the continuation of the trade in certain locations until the 19th century, despite or because of continuing changes in the law. Thank you. All right. And the show. All right. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Casey, and then she will share her screen. Casey Schmitt is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Cornell University, where she teaches classes on early America and the early modern Caribbean. Her book manuscript, tentatively titled The Predatory Sea: Human Trafficking, Colonization, and Trade in the Greater Caribbean, 1530 to 1690, examines practices of captive taking and smuggling, and what that meant for colonization, trade, and warfare in the region. Her research has been funded by the John Carter Brown Library, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Huntington Library, and the Folger Shakespeare Library. Casey?
Thank you, Erin. Okay, let me try the technology here. I'm having terrible flashbacks to teaching online for the first time. Okay. Oh, but now, let's see. Okay, I can't see the screen, but is everyone seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll just keep going. And then Erin, if something goes wrong, maybe you can stop me from talking.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here. I'm going to echo everyone by saying I wish we were together, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to meet virtually and to get feedback on this work. I think, as has happened with most people, this paper was something that I proposed when I assumed I would be able to get to the archives and do a little bit more work. So as it is, I'm presenting sort of new research and rough ideas, so I appreciate any and all questions and comments. So I want to start with a narrative and an individual whose trajectory really sparked my interest in this topic. And this man is a fisherman from Havana named Simón Rodríguez. So Simón Rodríguez left Havana in 1668 and headed out into the tangle of sandy islands and reefs that are sort of highlighted in this map off of Florida's southern coast. Now, his voyage was both quotidian, he did this all the time, and it was also rife with danger. Following the seasonal migrations of sea turtles to the Bahamas, Rodriguez joined a multi-ethnic assortment of sea workers who hunted the marine creatures in order to provision regional markets. But in the shallow waters off of the coast of Abaco, an English crew took him captive and forced him to labor aboard their vessel, likely hunting the same turtles Rodriguez sought before being taken captive himself. Now, after a month, Rodriguez's captors left Bahamian waters to sell their catch of turtles to the rapidly growing English population on Jamaica, which you can see in the bottom center part of that screen, or of that map. So the English captors carried Rodriguez with them, and possibly deciding that he was no longer useful and might be a source of profit, Rodriguez's English captors sought to sell him in Jamaica, as he described it, quote, to work for the space of 7 years in the countryside, end quote. Now, the intervention of Jamaica's governor prevented Rodriguez from being sold as an indentured servant, but he remained a captive in the island's jail until he escaped 7 months later, which is where I have his testimony of what happened to him. Seasonality and, in turn, vulnerability defined the labor routines of the 16th and 17th century Caribbean and wider Atlantic world. Sea workers, for example, followed the mating and nesting patterns of turtles or turned to raking salt during the Caribbean's dry season. Year after year, ships descended on specific locales throughout the region to harvest everything from turtles to salt, fish, or logwood. Now, the predictability of sea workers' seasonal mobility, however, made them also uniquely vulnerable to violence and captivity.
Casey?
Yeah.
It's stuck. It's not actually showing your PowerPoint. It's just showing it's not showing the show. So it's just on the first screen.
Oh,
there you go.
Okay, it's on the second screen now?
Yes, now it's on the second screen, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure how to, okay, I just have a couple maps, so I'm just going to go without it.
Okay.
I think that might be a little bit easier. Sorry to everyone in the audience, you just get to look at my face. Okay, so I was talking about how the predictability of sea workers' seasonal mobility made them uniquely vulnerable to violence and captivity, and how maritime crews, mostly English, French, and Dutch, raided contested multinational spaces of the commons in the Caribbean in order to seize food, maritime laborers for their own ships, and captives who, as I am researching now, could be pawned into regional markets. So captive taking was so common, in fact, that by the end of the 17th century, race in certain parts of the Caribbean started to define tasks assigned to some sea workers. So as Michael Jarvis has argued for Bermuda, for example, the vulnerability of Bermudian sea workers engaged in salt raking meant that by the early 18th century, the task was one assigned primarily to phenotypically white men who, as Jarvis describes, quote, as British subjects, had customary and international rights as prisoners of war, end quote. Enslaved Bermudians of African descent, by contrast, quote, were property subject to the spoils of war and could be sold or kept by their captors, and so were employed in the more mobile industries of fishing and smuggling. So, as Jarvis has argued, this familiarity with the market for captive labor led Bermudian enslavers to work out this arrangement to protect themselves from losing to captivity the people that they considered their property. So, the late 17th century racial logic that assigned Bermudians to specific types of labor in the commons developed over the course of the preceding century and a half, in which maritime predation ensnared a wide variety of people. So this paper, again, as I said at the beginning, represents a brief sketch of that earlier history, and of course some early thinking without access to the archives, which I would have appreciated. The larger chapter that this paper draws from looks at the way in which raiding provided Northern European ship captains with complete crews and with captives who could be sold in Caribbean ports. So it looks at the ways in which the lucrative but restricted markets of the Spanish Caribbean often resulted in local officials looking the other way when unlicensed traders arrived with captives to sell. Now, violence and informal economic exchanges went hand in hand with Northern European ships that sought safe anchorages to careen their vessels and trade for tropical staples, wood, water, and provisions. So, tracing their itineraries and activities reveals an alternative regional geography and political economy in which, as I argue in the larger chapter, subjects of different monarchs, indigenous populations, and people of African descent, both free and enslaved, created complex webs of vulnerability, dependence, and interaction that did not adhere to national or linguistic boundaries or the imaginations of metropolitan planners in Europe. So part of this project is also looking at the result of this trade in captive people on the development of laws and legal understandings related to who could be captive and in what kind of captivity. So, in his recent book, Wim Klooster argues that European mariners frequently applied the custom of the sea to landed settlements in the absence of state authority, or particularly important for my case, in legal confrontations that involved individuals of different empires. So maritime customs and legal practices also followed early modern ships. Lauren Benton has argued and described both ships as islands of law and, quote, vectors of law thrusting into ocean spaces. So this paper attempts to build on that scholarship by examining the maritime custom of seizing captives for their knowledge or capacity to work as a lens onto the rationalization, although I'm not sure I'm a fan of that word, but the rationalization of labor and concepts of subjecthood in the 17th century Caribbean. So here, I want to talk about the widespread nature of seizing captives at sea and demonstrate a little bit how this practice evolved with Caribbean labor markets, especially as mariners began to attempt to sell or smuggle the individuals who they took captive to buyers in competing jurisdictions. So by the second half of the 17th century, this maritime custom came into conflict with land-based legal regimes that disapproved of the practice of selling the subjects of other European monarchs into unfree labor. So in this way, the actions of the mariners discussed in this paper forced colonial officials into a more almost precise definition of who could be bound to what kind of labor in the 17th century Caribbean. So the practice of seizing sailors, fishermen, or dockside workers was relatively widespread during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. In some instances, European ship captains sought out individuals with knowledge of the local geography to serve as pilots and informants. Such was the case for a Portuguese canoeman from Cartagena, who found himself kidnapped famously by Francis Drake before he escaped and made his way to Havana in the summer of 1586. Now, with an intimate knowledge of the shoals, inlets, and waterways surrounding Cartagena, this Portuguese waterman likely made a tempting target for Drake and his crew. Now, the English were also not alone in relying on captives for strategic information. From the 16th century on, in fact, Portuguese and French ship captains often received specific instructions to take individuals whose expertise might prove useful in navigating. Now, the maritime experience of two brothers, Jean and Francois Gumbello, demonstrate the opportunity and peril confronted by those who made their living at sea during the early 17th century. In 1618, the brothers signed on with a 22-person crew on a fishing vessel bound for the cod-rich waters of the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland. When they left France, the brothers joined nearly 500 other vessels sailing under French colors for the cod fisheries of the North Atlantic. Now, for these two French brothers, of course, the insatiable labor market of the cod fisheries, where ships required between 5 to 10 mariners per single ton of shipping, provided employment at a time of habitual unemployment for their land-based counterparts in Europe. Now, while the rich resources of the Grand Banks attracted fishermen like Jean and Francois, the multitude of experienced mariners working those North Atlantic waters also attracted ship captains who sought able-bodied mariners to fill out their crews. And as the Gumbello brothers discovered, carrying out such labor acquisition often involved violence. So not long after their arrival off the coast of Newfoundland, an English ship attacked the French fishing vessel. The ensuing battle, according to the archival documentation, killed the entire crew except Jean-Francois and two other Frenchmen. The survivors found themselves forced to labor on their captor's vessel as it sailed south for the West Indies, allegedly attacking and looting at least 20 more ships along the way. Now, although dramatic, the experiences of the Gumbello brothers were not unique. according to the English pirate turned lawyer and statesman, Sir Henry Mainwaring, kidnapped mariners, or as he described them, quote, such as are taken out of ships at sea, were called, in his words, perforced men. Now, Mainwaring's experience, or his expertise, came from his own early career as a ship captain in the waters off the coast of Newfoundland during the 16 teens. Throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Grand Banks proved fruitful hunting grounds for captains who sought supplies or to fill out crews before sailing to the West Indies. In fact, by March of 1621, English officials in Newfoundland wrote the king to complain about diverse captains who raided fishing vessels and the coasts for carpenters, mariners, victuals, munitions, and all other necessaries. Now, according to this report, Flemish, French, English, and Dutch captains kidnapped 1,080 fishermen, sailors, carpenters, and gunners from the fishing fleets of the Grand Banks throughout the 16 teens. Now, mariners kidnapped in the Grand Banks, of course, compensated West Indian-bound crews for the inevitable deaths from tropical diseases or sea battles, but their labor also proved disposable depending on circumstances. This was the case for the Gumbello brothers, when after several months sailing in Caribbean waters, the provisions on the English ship ran low. In order to cut down on the number of mouths to feed for the homeward voyage back across the Atlantic, the English deserted Francois, Jean, and their 2 other French companions on the northwest coast of the island of Hispaniola. The Gumbello brothers and their companions by early August were captured by Spanish patrols on Santo Domingo, who delivered them to the island's governor, Diego Gomez de Sandoval. Rather than salvation, however, the Frenchmen faced, in fact, severe punishment, possibly execution, at the hands of Spanish authorities, since they had been ordered to execute all foreigners caught in the Indies without a license because of, quote, the thefts and damages caused by the disorders of pirates and corsairs in these parts. However, as Sandoval explained to the officials of the Casa de la Contratación, because the fishermen's arrival in the West Indies was, quote, not by their will or fault, instead they arrived only to escape from the English enemy who captured them and murdered their companions, end quote, he remitted their death sentences and ordered the men sent back to Europe. Now, a little over a decade later, another captive mariner would prove less fortunate than the Gumbello brothers. Appearing before Spanish officials in Santo Domingo in the late 1640s, a Bahian fisherman named Francisco de Acosta testified that nearly 2 years earlier, French pirates had kidnapped him and his fishing vessel in the Bahia de Todos os Santos, so off the coast of Rio in modern-day Brazil. The French ship captain who kidnapped de Acosta needed more men, and he likely saw in this Bahian fisherman an opportunity. He was taken captive and for the next decade found himself forced into the service of this French crew, during which time he traveled, according to his testimony, throughout the Atlantic world, crossing that ocean at least twice and serving in some capacity on a transatlantic slaving voyage. Now, according to de Acosta, after a decade of service to this French crew, they arrived at the island of Tortuga, where the French crew unloaded the enslaved captives that they had transported across the Atlantic. And as de Acosta describes it in his testimony, in this moment, the temptation of profiting from the sale of de Acosta as a slave likely outweighed his usefulness as a mariner. He described how he was sold to the French governor of Tortuga and how he escaped to the island's interior before he met 2 other runaways, indigenous people kidnapped from the Yucatan, who helped him steal a boat and sail to Spanish-held Hispaniola. Now, at this point in de Acosta's testimony, he argues before Spanish officials that he was a free man born of a liberated African mother in Bahia, and that he'd been kidnapped by these French mariners. And in some ways, he likely expected this testimony to lead to his liberation, to lead to his freedom. And in this sense, the decision of the audiencia likely came as a shock. For de Acosta, Spanish officials in Hispaniola opted to re-enslave him because, as they wrote in the archival documentation about his arrival, De Acosta, quote, seemed like a slave, end quote. So kidnapped initially for his skill as a fisherman or possibly a navigator or mariner, De Acosta proved unable to regain his freedom as a result of, as I argue in the larger paper, not just his African heritage, but also his social isolation in Santo Domingo. Where he could have used his familial ties in Bahia to protest his enslavement. His voyage over several thousand miles into this Caribbean world severed the local social connections that he had in Bahia and left him vulnerable to this decision of the Audiencia in Santo Domingo. Now, if De Acosta's journey into slavery began with the moment of his being taken off of his fishing vessel in Bahia, other mariners found themselves kidnapped and sold into varying degrees of unfreedom. So this gets back to Simon Rodriguez, the mariner who I opened the paper with in the mid-1660s. Now, as that example showed, this Cuban fisherman being seized in the Bahamas and carried to Jamaica to be sold, quote, for the space of 7 years in the countryside, to me is an indication that maritime crews used the various forms of labor coercion available to them in the Caribbean to profit from the sale of captives. Now, Rodriguez may have recognized what he described, this labor arrangement, as the English custom of servitude, of indentured servitude, although he never uses the word indenture in his testimony. It seems clear from his description of working for the space of 7 years in the countryside that his English captors envisioned his sale in similar terms to the indentured servants who sold their labor in the Caribbean in return for passage and freedom dues. Now, it's entirely possible, too, that the English crew who sold or who attempted to sell Rodriguez into indentured servitude were using what in Jamaica is known as the custom of the country, right, which stipulated that labor service times for individuals who arrived in the Caribbean under indenture, but without a written agreement, which Rodriguez obviously wouldn't have had a written agreement to his sale into servitude. In the case of Rodriguez, however, before his sale could take place, the English governor, Thomas Mudaford, intervened. According to Rodriguez, Mudaford prohibited the sale of the Spanish fishermen because he was of, quote, the Spanish nation, and therefore not subject to servitude. So although Mudaford saved Rodriguez from being sold into indentured servitude, he put him to work as a prisoner building fortifications and performing other types of labor necessary to the colony. So reverting to laws of war in which Rodriguez could be used for the kinds of manual labor that prisoners of war would be put to. So the lived experiences then of the Gumbello brothers, Francisco de Acosta and Simon Rodriguez over the course of the late 16th and early 17th centuries provide brief glimpses onto the maritime custom of seizing laborers and the development of practices of selling those captive individuals into Caribbean labor markets. Of course, the three cases end very differently. The Gumbello brothers were freed, De Acosta was resold into slavery, and Rodriguez and his crew were taken as prisoners to labor for the English governor of Jamaica before Rodriguez at least escaped. In all three cases, however, these individuals' entrance into evolving Caribbean labor markets forced the official representatives of those land-based legal regimes to adjudicate their status. As governors decided the fate of kidnapped mariners or captive mariners, they had to think through ideas of subjecthood, race, and bound labor in ways that forced clearer or at least inter-imperial or international definitions of who could be bound to what kind of labor and why. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Casey. That is the end of the presentation. So now we can open it up for questions. Maybe if people want to write their questions either in the chat or the Q&A, then we can read them. I think the Q&A would be best. So if anyone has a question. go ahead and type it in.
Erin, can I start with a question for you?
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about, I'm familiar with your work, of course, and Molly Warsh's work, and I wonder about the labor arrangements in the Pearl Islands. Could you speak a little bit more about when the enslavement of people of African descent starts in this region? Could you sort of take what you had talked about and carry it just a little bit forward?
Yeah. At first, it was until I believe it's the 1530s, 1540s, they really did depend on indigenous labor. And they really preferred Indians from the Bahamas. They were the best divers and swimmers. But also, you also find Canary Islanders there. They were also known for their swimming abilities. But by the 1530s, 1540s, as you get larger numbers of African slaves, then you do see them kind of coming in. But still, mainly Indians were doing the diving. So the African laborers were there more for kind of the cleaning, collecting, as well as canoeing, the actual transport of items. All right. Tessa Murphy has a question. So she would like, could I ask you both to reflect a little on how your work intersects with one another? Casey, do you see this earlier history of Indigenous enslavement shaping captive taking in your era?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Tessa. I have actually learned quite a bit from Erin Stone's book. I've read it very closely. And one of the things that interests me actually are the ways in which some of the captive taking that I look at in the mid 17th century, especially Jamaican mariners, sort of maps onto places where you describe captives being taken from. So right now I'm looking at a lot of cases where Jamaican mariners who are involved in the logwood trade, this is something that quite a few people have written about, but are in fact taking Yucatec Maya captives and carrying them back to Jamaica into enslavement. So I'm actually interested in the ways in which what you describe, some of the routes of captivity are routes that continue to be useful for English mariners, specifically based out of Jamaica.
Right. And then Tessa continued her question. So she asked, do you see justifications or rationales for Indigenous enslavement evolving as other captives or laborers become available? And surprisingly, not really. Into the late 16th century, and even my next project, which I hope to get started on at some point when I can travel again, is looking at enslavement in Chile and Argentina in the 17th century. And as far as I have seen, they are using the exact same rationale that they did from the very beginning. A continuation of the just war concept. So any Indian who rebels or attacks the Spaniards, and then the Carib idea. I mean, into the 1570s, 1580s, I see letters going from Hispaniola and Florida and throughout the Caribbean, specifically asking if they can purchase Indian slaves from Brazil because they are the most clearly Carib or cannibals. And the Portuguese are still legally enslaving them. So they are using the same rationale. I don't really see kind of like a race-based rationale for the enslavement of Indigenous peoples, at least not in the 16th century or early 17th century at this point. All right. Any other questions? And if anybody wants to jump in, I don't know if you guys have the ability to speak or turn on your cameras. Do you know, Casey?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and I think, Erin, what you were just saying is really interesting in answer to Tessa's question. And it gets at a lot of recent scholarship in the Caribbean, especially David Wheat and Ida Altman's edited reflection on the 16th century that's really pushing for historians of the Caribbean to take the 16th and 17th centuries on their own terms. So this idea of looking at enslavement as the justifications for enslavement being rooted in this kind of 15th century Iberian legal culture, rather than a more recognizable late 17th, 18th century racialized justification, I think coincides really nicely with what I'm trying to do in my work, which is looking at, when and how these conversations about who can be coerced to what kind of labor cross imperial boundaries, right? Cross national boundaries, but trying to take very seriously, a late 16th and early 17th century in which slavery is racialized, but the justifications are being developed, right? And what it means to think about it in that way.
Yeah, and what I find interesting too is that African slaves in my time period are so much more valuable than indigenous slaves that there is definitely a division of labor, but it appears, at least from what I've seen in the Caribbean in this early time period, that Africans are given less difficult labor than indigenous peoples. I mean, they're buying Indian slaves, for 8 pesos, 10 pesos. Interestingly, in the Pearl Islands, they actually would pay 100 to 200 pesos for an Indian with diving skills. But they're paying 300, 400 pesos for an African slave. So, just the difference in how they appear to be treated and kind of looked at in this early period is very, very different from later time periods.
Do you think that's just a lack of knowledge on the part of Portuguese and Spanish enslavers? I mean, I'm thinking of Kevin Dawson's work, which makes incredible arguments about the maritime skills and maritime cultures of West and West Central African peoples, right? That is there just a lack of understanding that enslaved Africans have maritime cultures of their own?
I think so. And especially it's very early on, the Spaniards really don't want African slaves from the coast. They want African slaves from the interior because they think that they're going to be much less likely to rebel because of their lack of kind of understanding of European culture. Because the first Africans who rebel in Española are definitely very, very familiar with Portuguese and Spanish culture and warfare and weaponry. And so they become very, very frightened of that. And they really seek bozales versus Ladinos very early on. You see that in the discourse. All right, we have another question from Joe Clark. Wanted to ask you about Casey. He wants to ask you about periodization. How does this story change over the last 40 years of the 17th century?
Yeah, thank you for this. This is a great question. And not one that I have a fantastic answer for, in part because I'm working through it. What makes the sort of early 17th century up to about the 1660s for me so fascinating, even the 1670s, is the disruptions to the transatlantic slave trade as a result of the dissolution of the Iberian Union, right? Portuguese independence, and then also the prosecution of Portuguese residents in the Spanish Caribbean. So in fact, Alejandro Garcia Monton has written a Hispanic American Historical Review article about this, that the sort of 1650s and 1660s is this growth of Northern European mariners' involvement in the transatlantic slave trade to the Spanish Caribbean, to places like Portobello is the place that he writes about. But what that means is that there's this sort of window of time, I would argue, from about the 1640s to the later 1660s, where the organized joint stock companies involved in the transatlantic slave trade haven't standardized or rationalized or really solidified their hold on the transatlantic slave trade. And it leaves open these opportunities for these kind of multinational crews, for these people who are receiving funding from, multiple merchants in Europe to engage in this trade. So in fact, the kind of mechanisms of the transatlantic slave trade are as haphazard as the kind of diplomatic understanding of, are the English allowed, are the English and French allowed to be in the Caribbean, right? Are their colonies recognized by Spain? So I'm particularly interested in this moment where any Northern European mariner is considered, an interloper in the Spanish Caribbean, at the same time that the demand for enslaved labor has created opportunities for Northern European merchants to engage in the slave trade to port cities in the Spanish Caribbean that previously hadn't been centers of the transatlantic slave trade under the Portuguese asientos. So, this is kind of the outline of my project, is looking at that. As you get into the 1670s, after the Treaty of Madrid and English colonization rights in the Caribbean are recognized by the Spanish crown, the Royal African Company gets on a firmer footing in this transatlantic slave trade. You get a more sort of standardized, inter-imperial at least, dialogue about the nature of captivity and subjecthood. So this is something that you see especially, or I see in my research, in the Lesser Antilles, right? Governors negotiating with one another over the restitution of captives, for example, right? So, to kind of fumble through that question, I would say you get a sort of more standardized discourse and a more organized transatlantic slave trade that's very different than the sort of period before the 1660s. Thank you for that question, though. I'm glad you let me know. It's very awkward answering questions when you can't see anyone, so I appreciate that quite a bit.
Casey, I have a question. So do you see the British, since they are much more focused, on sort of this racial justification for slavery, did they make the same argument with Indigenous captives?
That's an interesting question. Early on, especially in Jamaica, there's debates about whether or not the English should be allowed to enslave Yucatec Maya speakers, and Mudaford is directly involved in these debates. And part of what I see them discussing, in fact, has little to do with the racial background. I think for drawing on Catherine Gerbner's work, I think the English are sort of moving from these sort of religious justifications into racialized justifications. So this is sort of a process of transition. But what Mudaford gets sort of stuck in this debate is whether or not Yucatec Maya speakers can be enslaved because they either are or aren't Spanish subjects. Right. So they kind of use the argument, or at least Mudaford tries to use the argument, that these Yucatec Maya speakers can be enslaved because they're not subjects of the Spanish crown and in rebellion against the Spanish crown. So there's this sort of interesting, he doesn't say it explicitly, but whether or not he's kind of adapting a Spanish logic of just war in justifying the enslavement of these captives. In the end, he's told that he can't, right? He's told that he has to put a stop to this trade. And so then by about 1667 into the 1670s, it's an illicit trade, right? So a sort of smuggling trade of captives.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem is, he doesn't say exactly what I want him to say, right? He just describes this process, but.
Yeah, I recently read a book that was talking about the connections between either Yucatan and Florida and Cuba. And there's still some Yucatec Maya communities in the interior of Cuba from the indigenous slave trade, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
Off topic, but. Any other questions? We have about 10 minutes before the session is over.
I do wish we could ask questions of the audience. There's people in here I would love to get involved in the conversation.
Tessa says you could try. If only we could hear them speak.
Right.
Spatiality. Yeah, I kind of wish we were on Zoom.
Okay, I think I'm going to take Tessa's suggestion and actually put her on the spot
Okay.
and see if she wants to talk a little bit about the region that she studies in terms of these conversations about captive taking. Tessa Murphy's book was just recently published with University of Pennsylvania Press. Oh, except now there's a question. Mm.
I guess I'll go first. So actually in this time period, I mean in the and then we'll ask Tessa. Yeah. Or Tessa, maybe you can be formulating your response. But in the early 16th century, the Caribbean is actually the center of the Spanish Americas. I mean, in the, from the 1490s until really a couple of years after the conquest of Mexico in the 1520s, the Caribbean is the absolute center of the Spanish Americas. So most of the indigenous captive taking, enslavement, and ideas about that is all happening at the center. However, after the conquest of Mexico, discovery of Peru, etc., that is, I think, why the crown really tries to get control of indigenous enslavement, because they have to keep the profitability of those very central regions, and so you start to see a lot of new legislation saying you specifically cannot take slaves from New Spain. Or certain regions of New Spain that are going to kind of mess with the mining of silver and whatnot in that region. But you also see an uptick in more frontier areas. So, Central America, Nicaragua, Guatemala, et cetera, that are then being sent to Peru. So you see kind of, depending on the time period, the kind of movement of captives from the frontiers to the central points of the empire. Casey?
Oh, yeah, no. I suppose for my work, I would have to ask which mainland. One of the things that I want this project to do, in fact, is to dialogue with the 1619 project and with all of this new research on 1619, and to have a conversation about, the fact that the first enslaved captives who arrived in Virginia came through this act of maritime captivity is not new, and in fact it's tied to this much longer history of captive taking in the Caribbean, and captive taking for the purposes of smuggling enslaved captives into what you describe as peripheral, although I would describe as just Spanish Caribbean ports, right? So in fact, to look at the relationship between the development of these, what Greg O'Malley calls, these final passages, these routes of transportation of enslaved captives from the Caribbean to these other sort of mainland areas, being deeply tied with these practices of captive taking. So what I kind of want to do is then trace with this project, trace the earlier history that kind of leads us to 1619 as a moment, and then continue the story in the Caribbean of how this, inter-imperial captive taking and smuggling of captives shapes, not just colonization and warfare, but also the development of legal understandings of, slavery and indentured servitude in these inter-imperial spaces, right? In spaces in which people can easily move from one place to another. This is one thing that Tessa Murphy's work does such an excellent job showing us, the Creole archipelago, that this is a space in which discrete monarchs claim these territories, and yet, as Ernesto Bassi describes it, this is an aqueous territory, right? This is a place where a movement is common. And so to talk about, how that movement and captivity and vulnerability then forces conversations that cross imperial borders about the nature of restitution, subjecthood, race, and slavery. So kind of tying 1619 or the North American mainland to this Caribbean story.
It reminds me of an article. It came out a long time ago, but it was called Entangled Trajectories. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting, Tessa, about the people in the Southern Caribbean seeking refuge in Trinidad and South America. All right, we only have 4 minutes left. So if anyone has one last quick question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think.
All right, I think we're good.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you,
Right.
Erin, for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, again, wish we could have been in person. But if any of you are going to be at the AHA, I will be there. All right. Bye. Should we leave? Yeah. All right. Bye, Casey.
Bye.